Hi, I'm Jonas Dupuich from Bonsai Tonight. I am here on the Bonsai Time Podcast to talk about the Pacific Bonsai Expo.
So Jonas, I expect that the vast majority of our viewers already know who you are and have already heard of your blog, Bonsai Tonight. But in case some people out there have not heard of you, could you tell us a little bit about how you got started in bonsai? And I know that you had said in a previous interview that you started out in a family of nursery people, right?
Yeah, the family business is a retail nursery.
Yeah, so I'm curious why you went into bonsai, which is probably about the least profitable arm of the nursery trade.
But it's the most fun. And so I was actually hiding from customers in the back of the nursery, pruning some maples. Like I grew up liking Japanese gardens and pruning. And some stranger walked up to me and said, cut it here, cut it here. And I did what he said. And I thought, who is this guy? And he said, hi, I'm Boone. And so that's how I met Boone. And so we became friends. He was doing some ornamental pruning in town at the time. And he saw a bonsai that was at the nursery. I always knew what they were, but it just didn't mean a whole lot. He said, oh, do you mind if I take the tree home and, style it? We're like, what do you mean? He's like, wire it, clean it up. And I remember thinking, we have no idea what you're talking about, but sure, do whatever you want with it. He brought it back a week later, and this tree, it was a black pine, was all wired up. And I remember not liking it, but it was intriguing. And to this day, 28 years later, I remember precisely what that tree looked like. And that just kind of tickled my fancy. So I thought I'd like to learn more. And so we became friends, and that's how it really all started. That was long before he went to Japan even.
So how old were you when you first met Boone then and kind of had that introduction?
That would have been the summer of 1993, right after graduating college. So I was 22.
Okay. And then you kind of right away started going to Boone's workshops, or how did you get more involved from there?
Yeah, Boone hadn't started classes at the time yet. So I remember the first bonsai club meeting he ever dragged me to was at the Merit Bonsai Club. And we walked into a room where one grown adult was screaming at another grown adult. And I thought, oh, that's how bonsai works. It turns out that was knowing who the personalities were, who I won't mention now, but it turned out to be quite prophetic. Didn't go back to that club, but I did join a local club, the East Bay Bonsai Society. And there was a workshop that Kathy Shaner actually taught in Boone's backyard. And so I actually used to go and help out. And by help out, meaning I didn't have any money. I just finished college, and I didn't have any trees to speak of. I was buying gallon cans from the nursery. And I would hold trees that are being repotted, or do hard jobs, or take wire off, just do whatever anyone needed. And so I got super lucky in that the very first instructions I heard were from someone who had just returned from 5 years in Japan.
It's a good foundation then.
Well, it was, I just keep thinking, how much more could I ask for? I grew up knowing plant care at a retail nursery, and then to hear Japanese up-to-date technique just right on day one. I know that is a rare and precious thing in bonsai to this day.
And then did you ever spend time in Japan as an apprentice, or mostly you're kind of educated in the US?
Technically, no. I did spend 2 months in Japan. How long ago was that? Maybe 7 years ago. And 6 weeks of that was at Aichi-en, where Peter T was doing his apprenticeship with Junichiro Tanaka. And so I showed up the first day, and he said, what kind of an apprenticeship would you like? Would you like to just kind of hang out, take pictures, and talk to everybody? Or do you want to be treated just like Peter? And I said, same as him. And what's really hilarious about that is I remember making requests of him or asking for special accommodations, and he would just stare at me like I was speaking another language. And only much, much after the fact, I thought, oh, he was treating me like Peter. He was treating me like an apprentice. There were no special accommodations. If we were cold, hungry, uncomfortable, sick, that just wasn't relevant. So I had just the smallest taste of it. And it was easily at the time the hardest I'd ever worked in my life and the most fun I'd ever had. It's funny, I was 30 something at the time, or was it 40 something? I was 20 years older than all the other apprentices. And So my body was feeling it, but you couldn't wipe the smile off my face. It was just fantastic.
They were probably like, "How's this old guy keeping up with us?"
Oh no, they were making fun of me and they're like, why are you slacking? Come on, what's your problem?
Uh,
It was pretty great.
so, uh, uh, so that kind of covers what led you to become a professional. Now we can transition into talking about your show that you're putting on. And you've obviously seen a lot of shows in your time as a bonsai professional. So what made you see all of the work that went into putting on one of those shows and say, I want to do that for myself?
It's a clear sign of some mental inadequacy that I know as much about bonsai shows as I do, and yet I decided to go ahead with this anyway. So that trip to Japan was actually a good segue in that during that 6 weeks, I was able to visit the Taikon 10, set up the Gafu 10, and spend every waking moment at that show. No, I'm sorry, not Gafu 10. Gomangoku is the name of that show, the Daijuen family show. And we took all the photos from Meifu 10, which is the Nagoya show, third oldest show in Japan. And so I actually and we visited Sakufu. So in that 6 weeks window, I actually was able to catch 4 major Japanese exhibits, which was just awesome, between the photography, the setup, or just hanging out at the shows, as well as preparing trees for the shows. That happened to give me awesome insight. On top of that, I helped out with Boone's Club, Bay Island Bonsai, for most of the 19 years that show ran. I helped intensively with all of those, as well as visiting, regional shows around the country, whether the PNBCA events up in Washington or I've now been to, is it 3 or 4 different U.S. national exhibits. And so for my very first time, I remember Boone introduced me to Bill Valvanis and said, Bill, this is Jonas. He'll do whatever you need this weekend. Yeah, I got to go. And then he literally handed me off to Bill, and Bill's like, go clean that up or go pick that up or whatever it was. And so I just did that. And so I'm super lucky that I've been able to visit these shows, watch them from the ground up, clean up after them. And even the Nolanders event in Europe was fun, because although I didn't participate per se, I was roped into being a translator during the demo for a friend of mine, and I was able to learn a little bit about how they run that event. And so I'd been wanting to do this show forever, as had the co-host of the event, Eric Schrader, and the two of us have been talking about this for, it must be 7 or 10 years we've wanted to do this.
So I'm a little curious, what is it that made you want to have it in Oakland in particular? I know that it's an off year for the National Bonsai Exhibit, and it's also on the opposite side of the country. So I have to imagine that was a consideration. But why, the Bay Area in particular?
Very simple. I really don't want to drive to Rochester again. And then when we think of the practicality of how many volunteers, say we have 100 volunteers over 4 days, I think I want to locate the event as close as possible to the people that are going to make this happen. Mm-hmm. And that just put it right in the absolute epicenter of the Bay. We weren't particularly looking in Oakland. We were looking all over the Bay, actually. And it just so happened that there's a brand new event space that met most of our requirements. And so we thought, let's give this a try.
And so now we're kind of getting into the information phase of the interview, just so people know where to go and everything. And I'll note here while we're doing this that you do have the websites, pacificbonsaiexpo.com.
Yep, that's it.
Okay. So you were mentioning the venue being in Oakland had everything that you needed. What's the name of this venue, and where exactly is it located at?
So for anyone who's been to the San Francisco Bay Area, there's a bridge that gets you. San Francisco is a peninsula, and if you go due east from there, that takes you to Oakland. And as you go through the toll plaza, like right before you leave Oakland and start going over the water, there happens to be a large warehouse just south of the toll plaza, and it's a building called the Bridge Yard. The Bridge Yard's a historical building that was actually built to service the streetcars that used to run underneath the bridge to and from San Francisco. It had been used by a variety of different people, and now it has been taken over as actually part of our local park district. And so a venue management company rents it out as an event space. And we're just thrilled that we've got this old building with a lot of character and above all, tons of natural light. It's almost floor to ceiling glass on 3 of the 4 walls. And so it lets in so much more light than you say get in a hotel ballroom where so many bonsai events are held.
So on that note about natural light, and I know that in your Bonsai Wire interview, Eric brought up the same thing about how he would go to the shows and try to open up the blinds so that there would be more natural light.
Yeah.
What do you see as the advantage of that? Is that make for better photography, make for some more dynamic displays, or what exactly is like the draw of that aspect of it?
One way to say it is that it's different. A lot of the shows are really vanilla, and you kind of can't tell where you are. When a bonsai show's in an indoor space, you can control the light, which is fantastic. You can make good light and consistent light. And there's a lot to be said for that. We're kind of taking some chances. It might be sunny, it might be cloudy and dark, and that's going to have a really big effect on the trees and how they look in the display. And there's something just kind of fun about that to see bonsai while offering a sense of place is kind of a unique opportunity that we don't see that frequently. There's been a fantastic event that the Pacific Bonsai Museum has been putting on at the warehouse or just this last few weeks. And the photos coming from that are just gorgeous. These trees in large open spaces, looking out at the view beyond. In Chicago, Chris Baker set up some really neat displays for their recent show. And it just looked really cool to see trees in different places. It makes you see them differently. And so the primary goal is not to make anything better, but just to make it a little more vibrant and a little more place conscious, you could say.
Speaking of the place, I'm wondering, what are the windows of this venue looking out over? Is it
good question.
Or?
And it's interesting because there is a little bit of wall that's 5 or 6 feet tall. So you can look out, but you can't tell what you're right next to. So for the most part, you see sky. And so we're far enough away from buildings. Probably to the south, you can see some of the cranes at the Port of Oakland, since we're in pretty much our only neighbors to the venue are all logistics companies and the Port of Oakland. So it's piles of containers and cranes that unload cargo ships. And so that's the view to the south. And then up to the north, it's pretty much maybe some light posts, near the toll plaza, but otherwise it's pretty much blue sky.
Part of the ambience.
Now, I will say we do have, if the weather's good, we have a nice amphitheater right outside the building. And we actually have a few kind of surprise programs lined up, weather permitting, where people can sit outside. And then you have a view of the entire East Bay. So the kind of Richmond, Albany, El Cerrito, Oakland, Berkeley Hills are all visible from right where you're looking out there. And you can always look kind of to across the bay and you'll see the San Francisco skyline.
Kevin, I expect you to send me some Snapchats or, short videos while you're there.
If my one day in flying in late Friday, leaving early Sunday.
I want to see the view of the bay from the amphitheater.
The pressure's on, Kevin. Rain or shine, we need the bay pics.
Definitely.
I mean, it's very, very close to the water. The water's, in fact, if you'd go right past the venue, the parking lot at the end of the road is kind of a shoreline park where you can actually walk along a path on the new Bay Bridge, and you can walk halfway over to San Francisco just right from the venue, pretty much.
Sounds beautiful.
Yeah, it's a really cool spot.
Specifically, I know you were just talking about the show and showcasing what it's going to look like or what building is taking place in. What are the days it's being held, just so people know?
November 12 and 13.
Okay. And the times?
We are going to be open from 9 to 5 on Saturday and 9 to 4 on Sunday.
Awesome. And
we are already sold out on Saturday.
Oh, wow. I'm glad I got my ticket when I did.
And so we have a fair number of tickets left for Sunday, but we are pretty much at capacity. So we're expecting a pretty good crowd of people.
And tickets for how much again?
What are they currently now? I think the current price might be $35 a ticket for Sunday.
Okay. Still quite available as far as price too. What are the advantages you think of creating such an affordable ticket, comparatively to some other shows that may take place?
Well, that's what's so funny. When you compare them to bonsai shows, that's one way of looking at it. But when you compare it to how much it is to go to a movie, that's another price. And Eric and I were really conscious of trying to keep this as affordable as possible. Our budgeting from the beginning was with the goal of breaking even, which in hindsight wasn't the smartest way. And we definitely would change that to do it over, because as there are cost overruns, there never seem to be cost underruns. And yet aiming for a tight budget is there's always a strong allure to that. And so we really just tried to play it as close as we could with no markup. And we're still kind of working on that exact same model.
Are you specifically still looking for volunteers for the event, or are you at capacity for that?
On the website, there's a page for volunteers, and that's actually a way to still get a Saturday ticket or to save the money. Because if you volunteer for 4 hours, we'll cover your ticket the rest of the day.
That's a good deal.
That's really nice, actually.
Yeah.
Within the process of selecting jurors, and you explaining that, you've been to so many shows just in that short little window of when you were in Japan, and you saw their juried system. Did that influence you, and how do you approach this show and how you wanted jurors to be accountable in that way?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. We thought a lot about that. And I've actually been talking to a good friend of mine, Daisaku Nemoto in Japan, about what kind of model to follow. And so we've been talking about what prizes to offer, who should do the judging, who should do the jurying. For years, we've thought of so many different models. And what we came with is we were trying to do an event that wasn't about us in any way, shape, or form. And having outside jurors was a good way to do that. The funny part is we just kind of closed our eyes and thought, who would our ideal jurors be? And all three said yes. And so we thought, oh, cool.
Serendipity.
Let's see how that works out. Yeah, it did. So we're thrilled to have, Bjorn Bjorholm, Ryan Neal, and Bill Valvanis as our jury.
Yeah, that's one of the major reasons too why I was, in the dividing line of Ryan and I are both in school full time. I'm a new dad myself, and we're all the way in Ohio. So I'm like, I really want to see this first initial inaugural event because of the names attached to the juror availability. And I was like, plus I just want to see my friends in California. But it's exciting to see that is who came to be in the jury process.
We set up a really cool system for them where they were looking at photos of all of the trees in an online interface, and they all did it individually. So they had no influence on each other. Now, they could have called each other up and said, hey, what's up with this crazy submission? But I kind of doubt they did that. And so it was kind of fun for us to get a peek at what each of them wanted individually. And I can also say there was not a ton of overlap. Maybe a third of the trees there was overlap, and then there was pretty big disagreement with the other 2/3 of the show.
So was your general strategy on that just any tree that any one of them picked basically got accepted? Or if there was disagreement, how did you deal with that?
So that's a fantastic question. And what we did, we actually ran a lot of different scenarios once we had their feedback, and we tried to come up with what was the most representative pool of submissions that best represented the overall will of the jury. And so it wasn't 3 yeses you got in, 3 no's you worked out, but mathematically, I'm sure it did turn out that way. It was more like if all 3 people said maybe versus 1 strong yes and 2 weak, no's, we kind of went like that. What we did is we just had them put the tree into 4 different buckets: tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. And then we had not selected. And so what that did is allowed us to kind of stratify their strength, or, just put a number on the strength of their suggestions for which trees were going to make it. And it turns out that was just a really good tool that gave us the flexibility to see all those different things. And the surprising thing, each of the jury members left out trees that'll probably be prize contenders. And each jury member included trees that really surprised us and ultimately didn't make it. And so it's just a perfect example how different people's tastes are. And it's not just that they like or dislike. I think it's a lot more a matter of what makes a solid show. Some people have a bias. I want to see more varieties. Other people will say, I want to see more styles, or I want to see more sizes, or I want to see more different artistic approaches. All super valid, as you can imagine. And so it became a really interesting exercise to then try to take a pure snapshot of their will and turn it into the slate of trees that we'll be showing off next month.
That's awesome. Within the availability of trees that you now know that were selected, say like if you were in a play and you had the main character got sick, so you have a stand-in, right? Do you have that available for the trees if, say, something happens and they get a flat tire driving from somewhere, or the tree, hopefully it doesn't happen, it dies or infected or something? Is there a process you guys came up with for that as far as the stand-in component?
That's exactly what we did. And so what was great is our 3 pools yielded 90 trees, and we had a roughly 70-75 tree show. The rest became alternates.
Okay.
And so what we've been doing is monitoring. Some trees have dropped out already for various reasons. And so we've been either letting them fall away and having that adjust how we set up the room, or we've been calling up a couple of alternates. And so even right now, just not that many weeks out, we're 5.5 weeks out, and we have people preparing alternates just in case. Our goal is really to make sure that every single tree on site will have gone through the jury process. And we're being oddly strict about that. I'd love to be able to just say, oh, something dropped out, let's just drop in a pretty tree and maybe leave it out of the judging. But so far, we haven't had to do that, which is really cool. Knock on wood.
Yeah, because when I heard it's going to be in California, as you are located there, it made me wonder within the accessibility of getting through the border. I know that can be a very contentious process and very convoluted. Is there anything that you guys formulated to help the process get through, as far as like access to paperwork, or people had questions, you had answers possibly?
Squirrely as the process is, there's actually, fortunately, very little to it when it comes to the basics. And this is the same process I go through whenever I vend out of state. I actually need to do the precise same actions just to get my trees back into California. So every time I vend up in Oregon or Washington or even New York, I need to get phytosanitary certificates for my trees. So what people are doing is they are scheduling a visit from their county inspector. The inspector completes the paperwork, and then that paperwork is available at the border.
Okay. A lot more simplified than I've heard.
Yeah, where it gets funny is when you don't have the paperwork, or when people don't understand the process, who are the border guards themselves, or even there are restrictions for specific species. And so it's harder to bring a banana into California than a tree in most cases, because we have strict policies on fruit. They don't want fruit flies. That was a big thing, I think, back in the 80s. We had a big fruit fly scare. And so it's like, do you have any food with you? Throw it out. And they literally make you throw it away at the border. To this day, they ask you that question,
Huh. That's very interesting. I had no idea.
When you think of the size of the agricultural industry, let alone the forestry industry in California, I mean, we're one of the top 10 agricultural entities on earth. And so they put a little bit of effort into protecting that. Sounds
about right.
Yeah. And so that's the plan. The nice thing is that we'd know up front rather than after the fact. What's scary about going for me, out of state is it may not be stressful because you don't miss the show, but on the other hand, at least you have time to know you're going to miss the show, which is nice. So,
right. What happens if someone is expecting to have the paperwork ready, but somehow things fall through? As we know, bureaucracy and red tape is very big. Do they leave their trees there and then continue on, or what are the processes with that, if you know?
We set up a trebuchet in Reno, and we're just going to launch them over the border. That's our best guess. We'll have to cross that bridge when we get it. It would not surprise me, and we'll just work with every single person. A lot of county people can be really, really flexible about that, and there is no more formal process other than getting that paperwork. And so as long as everything's scheduled, they're typically able to get that paperwork together.
Okay. So the takeaway is befriend some good judges in California.
Exactly. That's right.
Will this show, as far as this first iteration being in California in the Bay, do you have plans for the future shows to only take place in the Bay, or will it go to Oregon or Washington State? Will it be a West Coast up and down show, or just be, like I said, specifically California?
We've talked about that a lot, and today's thinking is that we would continue to have it in Northern California. We are open to having it in other places, but it would pretty much have to be owned by someone in that place to run it. And so in that case, I would want to really take advantage of whatever the local strengths are of that community. And so the show might have a different theme. They might go about the jury or judging process differently. They might have different activities. Maybe they do workshops and demos as a focus instead of just the vendors and the exhibit like we're doing. And so we are open to that, but the current plan is, and we're talking almost daily about 2 years from now for our next show, where we might have it, what we're looking for, and how can we measure everything possibly going into this so that we know what adjustments to make next time.
Is that also seasonally dependent for everything as well?
Yeah. And so the reason we chose November is in Japan, all the serious shows are pretty much November through February. So deciduous trees can be shown. We thought fall would be fun because if someone happens to still have some fall color on their trees, we would love to see it in the event. My hometown of Alameda, we just don't get fall color. Japanese maples, believe it or not, turn a marvelous brown. It's awful. The leaves turn brown around Christmas and they barely even fall off the tree. So the trees just look dead. And a lot of people that do actually get fall color, they're going to go through that now and their trees are going to be bare by the time of the show. So I'm expecting to show my deciduous trees bare, but I know there's a lot of people trying to time it precisely so we can at least get some suggestion of seasonality in the room. And I think that'd be fantastic.
And maybe get a big refrigerator truck or something.
Like literally a friend of mine's planning out pillows for his car so that the jostling along the drive doesn't shake too many leaves off.
That's amazing.
It's pretty hilarious. I love it.
That's a long trip too.
Exactly.
With the first bonsai show you ever attended, do you remember which one that was?
First bonsai show ever was probably, I don't remember. It was very likely the East Bay Bonsai Society.
Okay. Within that first show, if you remember, what things stuck with you about that worked for the show? And also, do you remember what didn't work?
So I remember I ended up developing very strong opinions about club shows over the first few years, and that really heavily informed what Boone did with Bay Island Bonsai. And so in my mind, what really stuck out about club shows are things like people showing the same trees every year. And so we made a rule in the club, you are not allowed to show the same tree 2 shows in a row, period. And that's one thing that stuck out. Another thing that stuck out is that there was very little show prep done on the trees. At best, people would just pick up a tree in the backyard, and if we're lucky, they wiped the mud off the pot, and that was it. And what we would do for Bee Island Bonsai is we would oil the pots, moss the surface of 100% of the trees in the show. We would do touch-up wiring. We take all the wire off the deciduous trees. We would do really thoughtful displays that were planned out literally often 12 months in advance. And that's my biggest takeaway. And really to this day, most club shows, you see varying levels of preparation. And I've since learned that even with little skill, let alone talent, just putting the work into preparing for a show can just make worlds of difference. And I saw some of that in that Columbus show that you guys just had, that a lot of work went into some of those trees, and it really showed.
Yeah, and on that note, I remember about 1 year ago when you first announced the Pacific Bonsai Expo, you had released in one of your podcasts, you said, you should think about how the trees look today in order to pick which ones you might want to show for the show. So I thought about that when we were doing our Columbus show. I was like, okay, so I should think about 1 year in advance, how do the trees look? And that actually was very helpful advice for me, because in the past, when I was displaying trees for a show, I would go into the backyard a couple weeks ahead. I'd be okay, what looks decent. But I have found that as I've gotten more advanced in bonsai, I'm thinking ahead more about what I'm going to show.
It really puts things in context, huh? It probably affects how heavy the work you're going to do is, or how big those bends are going to be. And you think, maybe that new pot happens after the next show, or maybe you step up the repot to get it in that nice pot.
Yeah,
definitely. Within your time having helped prepare or volunteer, as you stated, cutting wire and have boons to try to get things done in that way. When did you know, or when, if it was a certain moment or just like this epiphany, I feel comfortable to put on a show now, or I feel comfortable to run a show now? When did that ever come about?
That's an awesome question, because I don't know that there ever was a moment. I felt like helping with the BIB show, that I knew every aspect of it. I was helping Boone run a lot of the back end of the show. I was the guy up at midnight printing labels for everything. I was the guy on setup day driving her all over town, picking up whatever odds and ends we needed, whether felt or folding tables or pizza to feed volunteers. And so it's like, I knew what the basic setup entailed. I knew what the odds and ends entailed. I will say that what I felt as, Eric and I are doing this show is a whole different set of feelings and emotions that I'm positive Boone felt. He was always very stressed about the shows going into it. And I hope we have enough trees. I hope we have enough trees. I hope we have enough trees. I've heard that phrase thousands of times. What happened when we opened up submissions to the expos? Eric and I, every day, I hope that person submits. I hope that person submits. I hope we get that tree. I hope we, and we really thought about it differently. The other thing I've been thinking about is, for a general club show, we thought, we're doing this for ourselves. This is going to be a great club show. And whether or not people come, it doesn't matter, because our members will be there and they'll be thrilled and it'll be a really good time. For this event, we're constantly focused on, how do I make this a fun event for the visitors? What's Kevin going to need when he gets here? What are we going to need to do to make sure it's a good experience? Like, what mood are they going to be in when they get there? How smooth can we make it? How transparent can we be about every mistake we make along the way? Like the fact that we're already sold out, or that we have limited parking and we're asking people to ride share or carpool to the event. How can we track our to-do list for the next event to make that subsequent show that much better? That's really kind of the big takeaway, is, what it feels like. But I think doing it with Eric is really what put us over the top. And we just said, yeah, let's do this. We could do this. We've done much more complicated things in our day jobs. And so hopefully we can make this happen. Little did we know we'd be spending upwards of 40, 50 hours a week doing the show prep on top of our jobs.
Oh, wow.
Wow.
It's been really, really nutty lately.
It's almost had to get an assistant for yourself.
We have multiple committees of roughly half a dozen people each, who are working crazy amounts of hours doing such good help for us. And we're actually thinking of hiring an actual admin in the future, because there's so much just desk work that needs doing. But we have had such awesome support. We have a whole team just to do the book for the show.
Wow.
And they're doing a great job. Like, the book's going to be fantastic. It's already been designed more or less, and we're already collecting the information we need for it. We're preparing a 50-page program that has information about all of the displays with artist statements in it that we'll be passing out at the event. We have a facilities team. Just as of yesterday, we finished building our backdrops, and now we're working on, wrapping up the fabric and our final tests for how it's going to come together. So it's just so, and then we've got our front desk and volunteer team, who's doing just an unimaginably complex job of making sure that when everyone gets there, they're going to have their name tag, their lanyard. We're going to know who's coming when, and we're going to make sure that they know where to go and who's going to help them figure out what needs to happen. It's a lot of, it's a lot more than any show that I'd ever participated in.
That sounds astronomical.
It is. And then on top of that, all that, we're doing this all online. So we're selling our tickets online. We're selling the books. We're selling the t-shirts. We're selling the banquet tickets. We're planning these events, and we're, trying to be as, forward thinking as possible in terms of the technology to help it, again, really to make the visitor experience as smooth as possible. And we're super happy with that. Like, it's been great.
Within all the time and funds and everything that you've put into, it's just a topic I've thought about as far as talking to people and nonprofits and ideas in that way. Can a show become a nonprofit entity if it's a recurring one? And
yeah, definitely.
In that way, funding can be more available through shares or, fundraising.
That's exactly right. And we're actually thinking really strongly about doing that for the future. We really did not have time, which is why we're running it through our businesses for this event. But we've actually already talked to an attorney about how that might look and what the pros and cons would be. If we were planning lots of events other than just the event. We would have done it already, but right now the key focus really is on this, 2-day open to the public event a year. And so for the time being, we'll run it through the business. But for a lot of reasons, I think a nonprofit's a pretty good way to go.
Nice. With your time, granted that you're available for us to speak with, we appreciate it and everything. With the Bonsai Expo and weather, what are some considerations that people should take into account? I know the Bay is always very flippy floppy, cloudy, sunny in a matter of 15 minutes, I've heard.
Yeah, and that's totally true. We don't, however, get surprise storms. We don't, like, thunderstorms kind of aren't a thing. We don't get those summer days where you wake up and all of a sudden, oh, I guess there's hail right now. We don't have that. So typically it's frontal systems. And so we'll typically know what the weather's going to be ahead of time. And with the single exception of some of those outdoor programs, the whole event is indoors. And so we're just not expecting it to have a huge impact.
Okay.
Your sightseeing might be curtailed. A lot of people are coming out. They haven't been to the Bay Area in a long time. They want to walk around San Francisco, see the redwoods or Yosemite. Those are the people that'll notice if there's any inclement weather.
As Ryan was just saying, he learned from your presentation, as I was in that presentation as well, of like looking to the next year, or pushing your thoughts to move forward for years to plan. Do you and Eric have plans for each show coming up? Like, are you thinking just next year, or are you thinking 3 years down the line, or 4 or 5?
Oh, that's fun. We have a couple ideas that definitely are evolving over time, but our concrete ideas are really about kind of identifying the scope of the event and identifying the best home for the event. Those are kind of the two big areas. So by home for event, that just means venue. What's the optimal venue? What's the optimal space, parking, proximity to amenities? That's what's going to give the event its feel. And that's what's going to be one of the bigger takeaways for the participants. That has nothing to do with trees. It has to do with what the overall travel experience is going to be to attend the event. In terms of the scope, we're looking at, is there space for demonstrations, for workshops, for normal convention type stuff? We've always identified them as maybes, but they're way below the list. Number one will always be a show. Number two will be vendors, but in the future, we want twice as many vendors. We just didn't have the space, and we had to make some very hard decisions about what we would do with our limited space. And so we actually asked people to take fewer tables than they requested, so we could just make as much room as possible for more people to participate. And if we had twice as much space, we honestly would have twice as many vendors.
How many vendors do you have on?
I think it's around 20, 25, somewhere in that neighborhood.
That's still a good amount.
Oh, and we're thrilled with the vendors. Like, we have a lot of, another goal was we have a lot of events in the Bay Area. We're super lucky with all of our local shows, the Golden State Bonsai Federation events. There's one coming up very soon. And we get a lot of exposure through those events, but we wanted to bring in as many new vendors. And so, I mean, from Oregon alone, we have Andrew Robson, Matt Reel, Ryan Neal, Michael Hagedorn, Randy Knight are all coming down from just the Portland area. And that's a really, and now Tokutake with his unbelievable containers. And so, and Vicky Chamberlain from Southern Oregon, as I expand out from Portland, that's a lot of people right there. And that's just off the top of my head. And so we wanted to just bring as many new faces as possible, because there are good friends and we think very highly of their work.
Definitely. Yeah. My homeland on that.
All right.
Ryan, do you have some more questions here?
Yeah, it sounds like from your ambition that you want to have twice as many vendors and adding workshops, which you don't have this year, in the future, that you'll be looking at additional venue options in the future.
That's right. And probably so long before we think of doing workshops, because we have a lot of, honestly, very mixed feelings about workshops. There's some great things about them. There's some really challenging things about them, but we want to do some programs. And so we would love to have a panel with all of the potters on site. Like, we have 5 people who make pots who are going to be on site vending at the expo. We'd love to hear from them. We're going to have 10 professionals from around the world at this event. We would love a forum for them to do a talk or a super critique or some fun kind of thing. And we're really excited about that. And then Eric and I want to do a Q&A for people that want to learn about the event and about bonsai in the area. Now, hint, hint, there's a good chance that if we do these programs that you now know what the topics of our programs are going to be for the event. And so we need space for that as well. And, food would be another thing that we could do. If we have meals or social gatherings on site, the Nolanders does such a good job of that, where they have social hour, let alone banquet, all at different rooms in this enormous convention center where the show is. It's a really, really cool space for that in Genk, Belgium.
Oh, wow.
So it sounds like what you were saying, you had all of these ideas for basically panels and ways that you could get your large number of guest artists involved in the show. And I want to dive in a little more about why you were saying workshops were a little lower priority.
Yeah.
Does it relate to the fact that, if you have all these people there, a workshop is not maximizing what you can do with all of those guest artists? Or why do you think that the workshop's a little lower priority?
It's interesting when you think which part of the bonsai community will be most likely to benefit from workshops and what the nature of the event is. What's cool about a convention is you've got a lot of people coming in from out of town, staying at a venue, and you're going to have people all across the bonsai spectrum. For an event like the US National Show, and to some degree for our show, it's a very destination-oriented event. Like, people are going to go to whatever lengths to go to that show. It's a surprisingly small percentage of those people want a tree to add to their collection where they don't have control over what that tree is going to be. And then you start looking at the overhead. Who's going to teach that? Who's paying for that person to come to the event? Where's the material going to be? Who's going to store that? And just the overall overhead of just the management of it, totally solvable, but it just starts looking like a very different event. And so those all become benefits when you start looking at how can we try to bring more people into the fold and make this a broader appeal. Because in a lot of ways, a club show will have a lot more to offer some people who really just want to show off their trees. They want to invite their friends and say, oh, here's what my beginner journey in bonsai looks like. And because we have so many awesome versions of that same event, we really wanted to offer an alternative. Actually, one place from which this whole event was born, when we went to the Balin Bonsai show year after year, we kept thinking to ourselves, what would it look like if we had a show just with the best trees in the room? Like, how awesome would that be? And then I started asking myself, going to other shows in the Bay Area, what would it look like if we had all of the best trees in the Bay Area all together? And it was just such an enticing prospect after having seen exhibits in Japan for so many years. The idea never went away. And I think that's what really got us excited about it. And it was when Eric and I were driving home from some event, possibly the Artisans Cup, and we're like, let's just do it. Let's just try and see what happens. And that was a lot of years ago now, 7 years ago, but we're actually getting around to it. And now we know what was good and bad about not doing it, in the meantime.
It's funny you say the Artisans Cup. I kicked myself. Ryan's heard this story. I was living 2 blocks away from the art museum. And at the time, I wasn't fully invested as a lifestyle. And my wife, Kumiko, was like, oh, we should go. And I'm like, busy working. And so that was one reason, too, why I chose, I need to go to this because I can't miss another opportunity.
Well, and so if you stop right there, that is such a key point. You literally described what we're going through with. If there was a workshop or beginner trees, it would have been so much more relevant to where you were in bonsai at the time.
Yeah.
And in hindsight, you kick yourself, and you would have loved it and it would have been amazing. But to come to the Artisans Cup with what you know about bonsai today, you would have had such a different perspective on it.
100%. Yeah, I appreciate that reflection on that. Yeah. And how processing through that. Yeah, because Ryan lived in Seattle, so he worked with Dan Robinson and things in that way. So we've discussed, being Dan's backyard industry background. Being that we've discussed our different approaches and/or I guess philosophies of the Pacific Northwest scene, and then coming out here and dealing with clubs and things out here, it's been an interesting river to ride through in the sense of that. Just as far as approach, availability of species, growing climates, all these things considering. what
And by
makes a good show.
approach,
And,
that's broad. The way
Yeah.
people think about it, the species they're working with, when and how they do things. Just plain what events look like in club culture. It's very different in the Midwest. I invented a new word there, the Midwest
Yeah.
and back east. And it's really cool. I've been to a number of those events, and you're right, they have a very different feeling. And it's true, something happens at the Rockies and things are just a little bit different when you get to the other side.
Now it is changing slowly, just due to people coming in and other things and new opportunities, if you will. And then like people like Rob Hoffman being a very big propelling missile of bonsai missile for that, making a lot of things happen here.
And Rob and I are on the phone every few days. And so, yeah, I know a lot about what's going on in your actual neighborhood. I'm sure he's the same with you too.
Oh yeah. I called me twice today. I was too busy to pick up, but I guess I have one more question for me, and then Ryan, will ask his. How do you go about specifically this show, but also any show for people that may be on the fence of attending a bonsai show for the first time, or they've never been to one, or they just are unsure of attending an event because the money, travel, or even if they're their neighbor of Oakland, like, well, I have stuff to do besides that weekend or something. You know what I mean? How do you sell that? How do you give that to a person?
It's interesting. And we actually thought a lot about that, because as we were deciding who do we want to invite to the event, we had to ask ourselves, do we just want the people who fly to any event? Do we want the local bonsai crowd, which is, from brand new through, 40-year veteran? Or do we want to get the non-bonsai public and expose as many people as possible? In a perfect world, we'd have an endless venue with infinity capacity, and we'd have everybody. And the more we thought about it, we really wanted to engage the bonsai community to the largest degree possible, because we wanted to provide the absolute most support we could for the vendors to come, because we want to give as much an opportunity for the shoppers to have the best opportunities to get what they're looking for. And we wanted to make sure the vendors feel the event is a success as well. So getting to your question, when I think of people at the beginning of their bonsai journey, I'm always impressed at how long people have thought about bonsai before they acted on it. I've had people tell me 30 years went by between seeing a picture of a tree in a book, and then I finally got around to finding a club or getting my first tree. Maybe it was only 5 years later, but there's some spark when you see a tree that people feel. And it's that kind of spark that you can engage when you come to an exhibit like this. The people who did go to the Artisans Cup, largely that event was successful because of a number of non-bonsai people that were there, and the oohs and ahs and just general wonder they felt at walking into this dark room with glowing trees. It was a unique experience that hasn't been repeated since, and nor do I expect it to be anytime soon. That was a beautiful experience, and I'd say every last person enjoyed that. I have also, then, to get to the end, what about the just general public? I often invite as many people as possible to my club show. I remember one year, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, I had maybe 50 friends and family come to a bonsai show. It was great. Coworkers showed up in droves. Family came in from all over. Friends since forever showed up. They enjoy it. And different people have different trees they like. So some people will see flowers, some will see the group planting, some will see the crazy deadwood and ask if it's even alive. And I'd say it's just yet another experience of it's just another way of looking at nature in an urban environment in our case. And just from past experience, people really love it. So we never twist anyone's arm to go, but we have great experience that when they do make it, they tend to enjoy it. What do you guys do in terms of selling it or getting people to show up? What do you tell that cousin who lives across the street from the venue and you're like, no, really, just come, it'll be fun?
It's funny you say that. My neighbor across the street, I found out because he came to our club show that we just had 2 weekends ago. He'd been wanting to do it for a long time, but as you just stated, he hadn't done it. And his thing was like, oh, I want to try a black walnut. I was like, go ahead and try it. I've never seen it, but
Good luck, but
never say never, And he came because his plans had fallen through that day. And he texted me, he's like, hey, I'm coming. I was like, awesome. And now his wife is hearing all the things that I talk about with my wife, and that's annoyed now too, I'm sure.
That's so cool.
But we actually, Ryan and I, we just started an official bonsai club at the Ohio State University, the first one ever. And we've got a pretty good range of people, I would say, as far as when we did our first quasi last minute outreach, like the day of, we were like rushing.
Yeah, I saw the photos. It was real. It happened.
So that helped. More than a few people came out from that way. As where our mission is just to get more public invites out, and that's why I was asking that question too, because we're trying to figure out that process, especially with cultural differences and availability of transportation and other things.
So the number one thing that comes to mind is the clubs that have had the best exposure. It's always when you have your show at another event. If you get the bodies for free, you're going to find that people love it. And so we have people that hold shows at fairs, at Japanese festivals, or other cultural events. If you can find any event at a garden where you already have the bodies for free, having bonsai there is going to help. And then by that token, even if it's not a full show, sometimes just having one person show up at an event to stand by a 1, 2, or 3 tree display with some postcards promoting the club, that's the kind of thing you can start doing to spread the word.
Yeah, the Puget Sound Bonsai Society, they always have their show on Mother's Day weekend at the Pacific Bonsai Museum, which is right next to the rhododendron garden, as you might know.
Which is such a perfect mom date.
Yes. So on Mother's Day, they get their biggest crowd of the year at the rhododendron garden, and then everybody comes over and they're like, "Oh, you guys are having a bonsai show. We didn't know that," but it's the perfect place in the perfect time.
There's a really cool festival they have at Lake Merritt in Oakland, where there's this place called the Bonsai Garden at Lake Merritt. Kevin, I'd suggest you stop by if you can. And it's this marvelous collection of trees, about 15, 20 minutes away from the venue is all. But it's a small part of a much larger garden center, and they do this annual event called the Festival of Lights or something. And they open the garden up at night, and everything is illuminated with, a billion little Christmas lights and displays and fire and all kinds of fun. And I forget how many thousands of people come through the garden that night, and they all love it. It's almost unnatural to see the trees with dramatic lighting in them. And so they get volunteers from that, and the clubs find that the attendance is greater at the next show. The Santa Cruz Club has their show at the kind of the opening to the Santa Cruz Art Museum. They get tons of people showing up to the first meeting after the show. And so that's really the big trick is, just get those initial eyeballs on it, but making them go to it from scratch, that's a much bigger ask.
Yeah, I think that part is a little more challenging for the local club show than it is for your national Bonsai Expo.
And I'm talking about club shows, and that's why I'm just telling you the best stuff we've seen around the Bay Area, because I totally agree. We've got a lot of excitement that the average, post-skippy show is not going to have.
But I was going to say this topic of, talking about the club shows, it gets me into the last area that I want to cover, which is what advice do you have from your experience planning this large show and from planning the Bay Island shows for other smaller club shows or even other regional shows, people planning those?
So what gets you to be too excited about the expo? What sounds exciting about it? Just any 2 or 3 things that come to mind, just quickly. What jumps into your head?
Great trees. I'll go with that one. And I was thinking about this a lot too, because I haven't been to a convention yet, but I was thinking it would be nice to go there and just talk to all the other exhibitors, other people passionate about bonsai. That would be probably the other thing.
Those are my top 2 when I go to big shows. My closest friends are at the National, and I get to see great trees.
Yeah, same. Yeah.
So same kind of thing for you.
Networking, friendship, and just creating more. I guess another thing for me is just creating ideas, so spread for better avenues to go down with bonsai and related with friends.
That's right. And so I think those are, for all 3 of us, a really good answer for people that are a little further along in their bonsai journey. When I think of, well, wow, what if a club wanted to do that? Well, it's really hard to compete on terms of having great trees, and it's really hard to compete in terms of who's going to show up to the event. But the Columbus show is a great example of community, because you added an extraordinary number of people, and apparently it was just a hilarious good time all weekend. The one thing that comes to mind that would work for a club show is if you can't be better, be different. And there are a lot of ways to do that. And the number one thing that comes to mind is to create creative displays. What I'd originally wanted to do for the expo is actually an extremely non-traditional approach to display. We wanted artistic displays that didn't involve a table on top of a bigger table, and maybe organizing it into smaller spaces. So that's two different things. The one, we were hoping a lot of people would propose to us wacky ideas of suspending trees from the rafters, or having no stands, or having like 19 trees in one little space, like just really different off the wall fun stuff. They ended up being really conservative, but we actually have 2 commissioned artwork bonsai installations that'll be at the expo that we're very excited about. And we hope to have more over time. So, and that's what I was thinking about when you said, what are you thinking about for the show over the next 10, 20 years? We want to see more creativity and more displays. My original idea was to have a more museum-like experience where you have lots of small rooms. Maybe we have all natives in this room. Maybe you have all Cascades in that room. Maybe you make a scene. And so I think a club show is very well set up to start getting people to work together and just create one theme and see how it looks. And like maybe do one fun wall where it looks like more of a landscape. Do one, boxed off section of tables where everything faces outward, or display a few trees in the round so you can see all the way around it. That's probably one of the easiest ways you can start getting attention for the event, by, just doing something that you don't see every time. But if you're just doing craft paper on a big table underneath a little table with a small tree and a small pot, we've seen that one before, and it doesn't really get attention unless it's a truly outstanding work.
Mm-hmm. Right. I guess the other approach would be too, is within a smaller club, you have people in the club that may not necessarily want to be involved with the new idea, or are weary of a new idea becoming a new avenue to go down.
Excellent point. And so another direction to lean is the more service-oriented direction, is how can you make it a more interesting experience? I think of shows as one of the most educational things we do in bonsai in the entire year. When you have an opportunity to study good trees, that's what's going to influence how you think about bonsai. It helps you identify what you do and don't like, what you do or don't want to reproduce. You can study the trees. And by offering people the experience of having more, not just a generic docent tour where you stand 10 feet away and say, this tree was planted in 1963. Instead, you can say, here's how they created the apex on this tree. Look up underneath. Take your time. Take turns and look up in there. And you can help people be as traditional as they want in their displays, and you can help new and experienced members learn like crazy by having multiple events throughout the weekend. Tiny story related to that. When I got to Japan in however many years ago that was, when I was there with Peter T at the Gomangoku exhibit, we had 4 days to kill with no responsibility at a show. Sounds great, right? Yeah, you get bored fast. And so you walk through the show and you're like, wow, this is cool. And then like you have lunch, you walk, let's go through the show again. And it's like super cool. 2 days later, you start saying things like, let's look at just all of the pots this time. Let's look at just all of the stands. Let's look at all of the accent plants. And then by the end of it, you're like, okay, let's look at how they're developing branch pads on black pine bonsai. And like, you just get more and more and more specific. And it just, even a modest sized show has a pretty enormous amount of lessons when you're new. But what you won't know up front, like you will know, you two have looked at a lot of good trees, but until you know what you don't know, it's hard. And that's where you could go that services route and just help people one-on-one via docents, via official programs with your visiting artist, just get a lot more out, like really milk that exhibit to the best degree possible.
We were really fortunate to have Chase Rosade and Jim Doyle being our visiting artists, because with that inertia of experience, history, and everything, and the whole cultural identity of bonsai in America, I think that was a really good selling point for us. And as well, that just means we have to kind of do better every year going forward now, because
let alone their charisma. I mean, these are 2 fantastic guys that we all want to listen to. We all want to hang out with them. And so, yeah, you did a great job getting both of them out for the event.
Thank you, Rob.
Yeah. Did you guys have
Brandon,
takeaways of what you want to do differently for the next Columbus show?
That's in evolving, let's say.
Cool.
Yeah, we are not quite sure if we're going to have it at the same venue or at the same scale next year. We're kind of waiting to hear how the club did financially. If we made money or broke even, maybe we can invite visiting artists again next year and do it pretty similarly and kind of build on it. And so we're kind of waiting to get all the data before we decide, basically.
Good. Your feet are touching the ground. I'm happy to hear that.
Yeah.
things that I brought up for this show, since I am now a father of a 4-month-old infant, was how can we have families come with kids? Because a lot of people who do bonsai have kids, and it's hard in that time consideration. So I brought up the idea of making a placemat for kids to draw on and color. I don't think it was utilized as well as I had hoped because it's kind of a last minute thing, but I think that gives us a better advantage point to embrace a family time within a bonsai show where mom can do whatever with kids, or you know what I mean. I think that's one approach that I took away from it, is how can we create this identity of just not a singular person's time, but as a family approach or community, as a whole.
Kids love bonsai in general. And I should say that as in kids who love bonsai really love it. A lot of them won't give a care at all. But I remember doing a program for a middle school bonsai club. They ate it up. They could go any number of hours working on trees, helping each other out. It was actually the most collaborative and positive event I probably ever taught at. And this is like 15 kids for 3 hours straight, maybe 4. I mean, it was crazy how many hours it was. And they just did not lose interest. We did a second session with their parents, and that was half as interesting. But boy, it's true. When you give the kids a few concrete things to do, like, man, to stand back and watch, it's awesome.
Yeah. At the Puget Sound show, we would always have, the People's Choice. And there was also one year, there was a kids, it was also kind of an art table, or they also had like a poet there who would help them make a poet for their mom on Mother's Day, or draw something for their mom. But one thing that I could always get the kids to do was to go pick their favorite tree and vote for the People's Choice. They all enjoyed that for some reason.
That's a perfect example. I always ask my friends when they show up to the show, if they're not bonsai people, the same question. I'll just point at a tree and say, which way does the tree point? And they'll say, what do you mean? I'll say, I don't know. What do you think? And that gets them, a non-trained person, into thinking, does the tree point left or point right? Which is an interesting and sometimes challenging question for us bonsai folks. And interestingly, non-bonsai people get it right more often than not. In fact, they might get it right more often than bonsai people do. It's kind of amazing. And so there's a lot of, I think, like your example, Ryan, of these questions we can ask them to get them thinking, get them participating, and make it a little more real, and just make it not heavy or burdensome. Like, what's your favorite? It's about you right now. What would you choose? I really like that
maybe
idea.
you could just leave some little signs around with these poking questions that people can discover in the displays. I don't know.
Yeah, I've seen shows actually do something similar where they have maybe a lot of shows have beginner corners, and some will show progressions where, 1 year, 2 year, 10-year, 20-year-old trees. That's really fun. Another will show a tree kind of before and after, before pruning, after wiring, to kind of explain, we do this because of that. Or even just having someone work on a tree in a corner, though, depending on who you choose, that may or may not be a good idea. But any of those things to get people involved. And it's funny actually hearing you describe the paper route. That's kind of what we're doing with our judging process at the expo. Did you guys have any thoughts about how we're doing the judging at the event?
So I did hear that you are doing the judging with all of the people who are exhibiting being the ones as the judge, right?
Exactly.
And
so if you have a tree, yeah, kind of. So if you have a tree in the event, you get to join the judging panel. And we're going to give everyone a piece of paper with kind of one line for every tree in the show. And we're just going to ask for a number between 1 and 5. And people have 2 hours to cast their votes on Friday afternoon before the show, on Saturday. We're also going to ask a second question and say, what are your top 5 choices in the room for best in show? And we're going to use all of those scores to come up with the category prizes as well as the best in show. What we'll then do is we'll have to plug in all of their paper answers that they're doing and get it into a spreadsheet. And then that's what the app is. It's kind of a back-end app, and it'll automatically spit out the winners based on what we upload.
So I remember you had a blog post where you had a scoring exercise.
Yeah.
And you said that, I don't know if this is the right term, but it's a relative scale. Like every tree ranges from 0 to 5. And in theory, I guess there will be the same, some trees have to be a 0 and some trees have to be a 5, even if they're great trees, you know?
Oh, yeah. What I was saying is there's kind of two basic, there's lots of approaches, but two basic approaches are whether you judge on a relative scale or absolute scale. If I judge the show on an absolute scale, the worst tree I've ever seen is a 0 or a 1, and the best tree I've ever seen is a 5, which means that the entire show is going to be 3s and 4s with a 2 in there. Whereas if I go on a more of a relative scale, what I'm going to do is tell people, and this is what we're planning on, 3 is based on the trees in the room, 3 is average. 5 means it's a contender for a prize, and 1 means it's just has further to go before it's in that in contention for a prize. And so luckily we've got a mathematical way to kind of blur everyone's scores so that we can compare them equivalently. That's what that Z-scoring is. But we're going to encourage people to use the scoring in a somewhat consistent manner just to give them a concrete starting point. They're going to do what they're going to do with it, and we'll modify their scores after the fact. But it's we actually tested doing it both ways, and we really like the results when you set a standard for them, because then it gives you a little better idea of how the entire room stratifies. We're going to make all of our scores public so anyone can crunch the data who wants afterwards. They'll be anonymous, but public.
How did you come about with the Z scoring out of all the other variables you could have used? I mean, did you approach people with the idea like mathematicians, or did you guys come up on your own?
We were so fortunate that we took careful notes from the Artisans Cup. So that was back around when I learned about Dan Yammans, who is actually a practitioner who was back east, and now he's at the West Coast. And he actually wrote a little paper about the scoring at the Artisans Cup. And he pointed out some of the opportunities the organizers of the Cup had to do more accurate judging, very specifically by throwing out the highs and lows for each tree. That meant that if your personal scale was lower than the person next to you, that very few of your votes counted. And so what happened is that one of the judges, very few of his scores counted relative to the other judges, where almost all of their scores counted. Whereas the simple application of Z-scoring, he pointed out, would have been a really cool way to do it. And that would have allowed everyone's scores to count equally. And so we don't have to throw out highs and lows, because we have, up to, probably between 30 and 45 different jury members, depending on how many people want to participate. But everyone's scores are going to be across the same scale. And that's one of the neat things that you get from the Z-scoring. So that's 100% Dan Yammans. Thank you for helping us out. And he's the one who's building our app right now. So we've been talking about this for a year, testing different systems, talking to my friends in Japan, how Japanese shows are evaluated. And now we're putting the final finishing touches on our evaluation and methodology.
Nice.
And are you going to be priming your jurors at all, like telling them, okay, you start here, you start here? Because I remember there was some discussion with Eric about the scoring fatigue and how, if people all go through the room the same way, there might be some bias there.
That's right. And so the way we learned that is I had a small number of people at different stages of their career. I had beginners, intermediates, and professionals judge the show. And we judged, I just showed them, we had all the trees in one column, and we just flipped next, 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 next. And in every single case, the scores got higher as we went along. And it wasn't a little bit. It was like the top 10 scores were among the last 15 trees on the list, and the bottom 10 scores were among the first 20 trees on the list. And so it's funny, I wasn't even going to crunch the data, but then I thought, I'm kind of curious, and how's this work? And I'm like, there were a couple really bizarre results. And so I kind of probed deeper, and that's when I started seeing these trends. And when I talked to people that actually do this stuff for a living, like, oh yeah, that's like a known bias. And they all gave it different names. And so, yeah, we're actually considering starting people at different places in the room. I mean, they can judge it in whatever order they want, but if we can all make a hedge against it, people who don't know what their scale is because they haven't seen the whole show or thought about it tend to award scores, at least in our teeny tiny examples, that are a lot lower because they don't know it's coming. By the end of it, if they're impressed, their scores will be higher. By the end of it, if they're not impressed, their scores might be overall lower. And so even if there's a bias for that, if we can disperse it around the room, it should get closer to balancing out.
So this is kind of getting into, how to remove that bias. But you said starting the people out around the room differently is one way. But could you also instruct the jurors to walk through the entire exhibit before they start judging? Would that kind of help with this?
We could, and for very practical purposes, we assume people are just going to start walking around. We are organizing the show by size. So there will be large trees together, medium trees together, and the small trees together. Species, whether deciduous, broadleaf, or conifers are all going to be mixed up, but they will be judging by size. And so knowing that they have to pick winners within those categories, that they'll need the flexibility. What I give that one again, and who really are my best contenders? But from a practical purpose, if you just scored a tree and you've only got 2 hours and you'd rather just go to dinner or talk with your friends, you'll probably go look at the tree next to you and then the one next to that. And so that's one of the things that we're going to be paying attention to. Eric and I are both scoring the show ourselves because we have trees in the exhibit, but we're going to be paying a lot of attention to whether or not there's traffic jams or sticky points. And then we're going to measure the results and see where hopefully things worked well and where, if possible, they don't work as well. We're really excited to look at the scores. There are several trees that are contenders in each category, and we're just dying to know which ones it's going to be. And so we're going to announce the winners at the banquet on Saturday night. We'll have the trophies on display for the first time, so people will see the trophies that night, and then they will get to find out who wins.
Sounds like a good time.
Yeah, it should be fun.
Any other questions, Kevin?
I was going to ask specifically about event space, as I know we've discussed for the Bonsai Expo and your guys' choice of choosing that. What could you say as far as a helpful progression or a helpful talking points for local club shows, smaller venues, things in that way, what to look for, what to approach in the idea of wanting space for community, or in the idea of just hosting bonsai? What makes a good event space?
Based on every club show I'm familiar with in the area, cost is probably the first 6 out of 10 considerations. But once you have cost out of the way, honestly, parking is the very next one. And flexibility with the venue, like, are they cramming you in between other events? Are there other events in the same building that might impact the experience for visitors? There's a great space in Oakland right at the Bonsai Garden at Lake Merritt. But often when there's a show there, another group might have an event in the area and there might just be nowhere to park. And so these really seemingly dumb things can have a big effect on the event, at least when you're in a big urban area. Like if you're right in the middle of town in Columbus, that could have an effect. There are national shows at an indoor soccer field in suburban Rochester. And so a lot of parking, a lot of space inside the room, and that's fantastic. And so honestly, I'd say the first things to check are the really boring kind of checkbox items. And then from there, what's the most inspirational space you can find? Is there a garden outside? Is there anything interesting about the architecture? And is there anything intriguing about the light? And then to think a little bit out of the box, could we maybe have one row of trees separate from the others because there's a nice natural backdrop? Or would it be worth helping guide people into the show by putting a few trees on their way in so they don't see maybe the whole show at once, but they're exposed to first this tree, first that tree, now another tree. The World Bonsai Convention in Saitama a few years ago did that, where you actually walked down a long hallway and you were reading about the history of bonsai on posters on all the walls. You turn the corner and bam, there's the logo tree for the event, this enormous, enormous juniper. Then you turn into another room, which is like a fake Japanese temple with a small number of trees. You turn the next corner and it looks like a more modern bonsai display room. And so they gave you all these experiences, and then you open up into the big wide venue. So just I think outside of the box, it'd be, maybe it's not one hall. Maybe we have other spaces. And then you just have to think about things like traffic control and security.
There's always ADA requirements too and everything else.
Honestly, the reason that we ended up going with straight rows at the expo, we had just two reasons. Otherwise, I would have created those little intimate spaces I mentioned. Number one, security. A security guard, whether on our staff or paid, can just look down the row and see whether or not hands are crossing the plane and reaching in and touching trees or getting curious about stuff. And the other reason is simplicity. Like, we've got too much to do, and that just made it easy to make, I think we ended up with, 6 rows of trees with 3 aisles. It's that simple.
So do you think, with the idea that you were just discussing with the intimate rooms, would it be better on a smaller scale of a show, as far as like that kind of an intimate portrait of what things can be in a selective environment?
Oh, that's a good question. I think it actually could work with both. If you happen to have a large space where you also had some small rooms. One example would be, maybe you set up formal tokonoma or tokonoma inspired displays in side rooms, and everything else is in the big room. And that would be a kind of a fun, intimate way. Maybe you have a room where you project a tree onto the wall and you let the kids draw on that wall because you've covered it with paper or something. So there's some kind of, and I thought of that because, I forget her name now. Professional in Japan actually set up a few bonsai scenes where you walked into a very dark room and there were projected images in the background on top of a tree, and the tree was showing the different colors of the projection, and the shadow of the tree ended up in the quote landscape projected onto the wall. And I think there was a seaside scene and a mountain scene, and there were a few extra bonsai elements like tree branches or arranged flowers or landscape materials that evoked a place. And so that was kind of a cool alternative as well. But you guys have way more ideas than we had for our show.
We're at the 1.5 hour line mark here, and I know you got things to do. I just was going to ask, is there anything that you've come up with just in the, however many weeks left till the show, that you've wanted to discuss, or in the last how many years you've been planning that you haven't been able to discuss? Is there anything in that way that you would want to talk about right now?
I'll save all the boring stuff, because if you two end up putting on shows, you're welcome to pick my brain any old time and I'll help with that. And if the world wants to hear that, we'll chat about that anytime. But I'll probably repeat what for me was one of the most poignant descriptions of just how precious an opportunity an event like this is, that Eric mentioned in a recent podcast we did on the Bonsai Wire. And he said, imagine how much work it would take to see these 73 trees at all of the owners' gardens. So you're going to 45 different locations in 6 different states. And then you're going to see the tree not prepared for show, with no backdrop, with no accent plant, with a dirty pot in a busy garden with a whole bunch of other stuff around it. How long would it take you to see these trees? And even then it would be a worse experience. When I step back to think how much time every exhibitor puts into these, when I think of all the effort our volunteers and committee folks are going through, it's kind of a miracle that the event even happens. And it's just going to feel, honestly, every bonsai show I go to from here on out, it's going to feel so much more precious, because I'm not going to see a tree on a table. I'm going to see the hard work of the exhibitors, and I'm going to say a small thank you to them in my head because of how great it is. Not a big selling point maybe for a first timer, but for all of us bonsai folks, I think it's a really poignant way of looking at why, as a beginner, I might want to go to one of these shows and give a regional show a try.
I think that's a perfect note to end on. I think so. Again, what are the days, just so we can revamp on that? It's
November 12th and 13th. And that's in Oakland, California at the Bridge Yard. All of the information is at pacificbonsaiexpo.com. And Eric and I are talking a lot about it on our own platforms. Pacific Bonsai Expo has an Instagram page, a Facebook page. And so it's pretty easy to find about it, even if you get the name wrong. And if all else fails, just search for Jonas and Bonsai and you'll find me, and I link all over to it.
And if we have any new listeners and they want to hear more about you, your podcast you have with Michael Hagedorn and everybody else is named what again?
The Bonsai Wire Podcast. And I think we're at bonsaiwirepodcast.com. And yeah, that's with technically, I think our hosts are Andrew Robson, Michael Hagedorn, John Eads, Carmen Leviansky, and who else do we have now? And then frequent guest, Eric Schrader. But all of us are on the podcast from time to time. Sometimes we do our own episodes. Sometimes we do them together. Andrew and I have been doing most of them lately just because we think it's really fun.
Nice.
Yeah, big cast.
Exactly.
Well, Jonas, Ryan and I both really appreciate your time and the consideration to be a part of our little tiny podcast in the pool of big
thanks
podcasts.
So much. It's fantastic. And I've been enjoying listening. So you guys keep it up as well.
Awesome.
And nice to meet you again a little more thoroughly this time.
Yeah, it's funny. I've been following you online for actually many, many years, and I've
really?
enjoyed yeah, definitely. I'm like,
I didn't know anybody
good
read my blog, but that's nice to hear.
Yeah, whether the blog or even back for some early social posts that came from the garden. And when I finally realized that you were working in Landon, I'm like, okay, that makes sense. Because I'm like, these are really amazing trees.
Yeah, definitely. When I first started out, I had no way that I would work on a tree like that just on my own. Dan gave me all the confidence and all the exposure there, so I owe it all to him.
Oh, that's fantastic. Dan's a pretty awesome character to work with, and I hope more people keep interviewing him because he's just fun to listen to.
Yeah, that is definitely true.
Awesome. Well, you guys take care, and Kevin, I look forward to seeing you soon.
Yep, we will see you then. Take it easy.
Good luck at the show.
Thanks so much, Ryan.
Bye.
Bye.
Today's episode has been recorded, produced, and edited by Kevin Ferris and Ryan Houston. Our music was provided by MIDI Cancer. To find more music from MIDI Cancer, check out their SoundCloud and Bandcamp pages. To find more information on the podcast, please check out our Instagram page, Bonsai Time Podcast, and our website, bonsaitimepodcast.com. To stay in touch with us, Kevin's Instagram is Kevin_Ferris, PNW, and Ryan's website is right2tree2.com. You can find these links in the description below. Thank you for listening, and bonsai on!